President Trump has taken to Twitter to call COVID-19 the Chinese virus. What is he hoping to achieve with this contentious remark? And Africa is gearing up for a possible major outbreak of COVID-19. What can the continent learn from its own experience of fighting Ebola? Welcome to The Point, coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Wang Guan, sitting in for Liu Xin. The Chinese virus, that is how the President of the United States characterized coronavirus in his latest tweet. In that tweet, he also said he will support U.S. industries affected by the outbreak. Trump's tweet comes after the Wall Street suffered the worst percentage drop since the 1987 stock market crash. Is the U.S. President resorting to xenophobia and nationalism to divert attention from his failure to control the outbreak? Joining me now from Washington, D.C. is James Early, CEO of Stansberry, China, and from Beijing, via Skype, is Professor Baocheng from the University of International Business and Economics. We'll discuss all those issues and more. I want to begin with you, Mr. Early. Let's first of all take a look at Trump's tweet, whereby he said the United States will be powerfully supporting those industries like airlines and others that are particularly affected by the Chinese virus. We will be stronger than ever before. So, Mr. Curley, what's your reaction when you first read the tweet?
Well, I think those words were a mistake, and I think they come across as pretty insensitive from Trump. I certainly would not have advised that if I were his PR advisor, not that he would listen to a PR advisor in the first place. In limited defense of Trump, I would say I think what he's doing is not so much randomly lashing out at China as a nation in that tweet. It's more a reaction to this Chinese foreign ministry conspiracy theory stuff that we're seeing now, insinuating or saying that the U.S. Army may have started this virus, which I think is, at least in the Western world, is pretty unanimously seen as ridiculous. So, and frankly, I think that's a PR mistake the Chinese propaganda unit is making. But in terms of Trump's response, it would be much better for him to call it out directly and say what he means rather than try to take a little jab at it with this Chinese virus stuff, because that gets confused, that gets misinterpreted by people, and it certainly causes a little bit of an uproar like we're seeing now.
Well, Professor Liu, you just heard from Mr. Early, whereby he said this is basically a counter-reaction from Trump to China's, attack on the U.S. Do you agree?
Well, I wish it was really an ignorant mistake because he didn't have the time or energy to learn new vocabulary. So either it is really coronavirus or it's COVID-19. But the fact that he responded with such a word, that is really pain on China. So this is a very strong mistake, and hopefully there is no really vicious attention out of it. But actually, before, even Pompeo, as a top diplomat, also made such sort of remark as to refer as Wuhan. So if it is really an ignorant mistake, like referring MERS as Middle East respiratory, the problem. So that is really not acceptable. But we do not read vicious attention. But if it is really politically trying to shrug off his own responsibility or inadequacy in providing the right type of governance and service to the American people, and that is totally unacceptable. And also during such a tension over the whole world are really facing panic, and they try to identify where is the source, who are there to be responsible by having the rhetoric as Chinese virus, and that is there to invoke the continued discrimination against the Asian community, and particularly naming the Chinese community, and this is politically a vicious result, at least.
Well, Mr. Early, do you think this is an effort, by that I mean Trump's tweet calling this the Chinese virus, do you think this is an effort by the President of the United States to divert attention from many of his own failures, arguably, regarding prevention and control? And let's not forget, this comes right after one of the worst stock market crashes in the history of the United States.
I mean, diverting is a standard political trick, and we can't rule that out here, though. I would say a very strategic calculation on Trump's part, maybe giving him a bit much credit in this case. I think he's just barely getting his own hands around this virus, and he did clearly underestimate it in the beginning. I think that's pretty clear, and he's got an election coming up to worry about. So, yeah, I mean, it wouldn't hurt to distract from some of that, but, you know, I think on both sides, on the U.S. side and on the Chinese side, there's really little to be gained, ironically, from blaming the exact point of the virus. I mean, obviously it took root in China. That happened. That's done. You know, hopefully we can all move on as a species and as a humanity from that. But yeah, I think this move was a miscalculation.
Both sides should move on. I would agree with that. But the Chinese Foreign Ministry just responded to Trump's tweet. Let's take a listen.
The World Health Organization and the international community are clearly opposed to linking the virus to specific countries and regions and against stigma. We urge the U.S. to immediately correct its mistakes and immediately stop unjustified accusations against China.
So, Mr. Liu, we've seen an escalation, at least in the rhetorics, between China and the United States. Do you think this trend will continue? And do you think this will really jeopardize efforts for both sides to contain this epidemic, or pandemic, rather?
It is already hurting the sentiment on both sides, and also that has also elevated to the diplomatic relations, because you know, the both of those diplomats are really pointing fingers, and right now this is really irrational, because there is no verified evidence whether it is really originated in China or originated in the United States or everywhere. And when the conspiracy theory is really flying over the world, it is particularly crucial for politicians and for diplomats to remain very calm and respect science and respect facts. So fiction can really travel very fast, and rumor can really hurt people. So you know, as responsible leaders, it is not acceptable to take it as, you know, out of convenience or out of vicious intention. And so I hope that there can be a certain clarification, if not apology, from the U.S. side. And there also has been overreaction from China. So I think they will restore to ration and respect science, and then come down, so that they will not really escalate to certain, heightened tension.
Well, definitely. You know, Trump's tweet and the rhetorics from both sides have generated quite some discussions on social media. Let's look at some of them. Social media user HoHoF said, "Viruses could start anywhere. The Spanish flu and the H1N1 started in the U.S. China has done everything it could to stop the virus, the coronavirus, from spreading, but people are moving around the world, and if the virus is spread in the U.S. government is held accountable, not China." But some other folks do not agree. For example, this user of social media, the Bradford File, said, "Thank you to President Trump. Thank you for calling the virus what it is, a Chinese virus. China is responsible for all of this chaos, carnage, and costs. They must be held accountable." Mr. Early, how do you look at these polarizing remarks?
Well, of course they're ugly. You know, these kind of comments come out when doors are opened with words like Trump used. I will say, in the interest of being balanced, the same thing happens in China, and I've seen it. There's a very active little red guard, and it definitely comes out, and it's definitely fomented by many in the Chinese media as well. So that's why I agree with the idea of toning this down on both sides, because it's not pretty. Both the U.S. and China sort of know that each one is the center of the world. That's how they were raised. That's how they were educated. And you know, there are definitely zealots, they're going to look for something to grab onto on both sides. Again, I think it's a PR mistake for China to be pushing the conspiracy theory, quite frankly. They should be riding high on successfully controlling the virus. That is fantastic. That is a PR win. That is something that basically no other country has been able to do, and they did it very well. I think they should be coasting on that and not pushing more. I think both sides should kind of quell this down rather than let it get out of hand.
Well, on controlling the virus, there are some discussions in the social media as well. For example, the Marco Solo to happen, by the name of Marco Solo to happen. He or she said, they also set a great example. China set a great example on how to stop and manage the outbreak. The U.S. has done little to prevent the spread of the virus and continue to blame a recovering China, whereas another user by the name of Brooker said, do you know how many people there are in China? 1.4 billion people, 5 times yours in the United States. I think the Chinese government has done a good job with so many people. The virus has basically been eliminated. I would like to ask if the United States can do the same. Professor Liu, is it fair to say that China has been largely able to eliminate the virus, and now many of the U.S. arguments and attacks are not legitimate?
Well, actually, different countries have very different situation, different culture, and the level of compliance from their people is also vastly different. So actually, I'm not really particularly in favor of China inviting praises or high commands. It's really up to the world to exercise their own perception over China. There can be certain criticism from their own standpoint of view, but the fact that China has really taken very harsh measures, paying very tough economic prices to contain this virus is really a fact that is really worth the pride of all Chinese people. And this model may not be applicable to the United States, to England, or to Italy, but there has to be certain respect and sympathy over the efforts made and over the difficulties each country have encountered. And actually, even more on top of that, countries, particularly, China can really share the experience, share some of the clinical data, and the world can really work together so that we are able to move faster on the discovery of new vaccines, or even to work together on academic research so that the world can really get better sooner.
Well, talking about economic impact, Mr. Early, I'm looking at the major indexes on the U.S. stock market right now. There has been little movement as of now regarding the major indexes after the historic crash yesterday. The President of the United States came out and said on Tuesday that the U.S. economy may be sliding into recession. Is he trying to manage people's expectations, or is he being more truthful this time around, Mr. Early?
Well, if Trump is saying we may be sliding into recession, I think that's truthful, and I think that's honesty that should be welcomed. There's no denying, a virus like this is going to take a major effect on any country's economy. Goldman Sachs was estimating that for the last quarter, China's GDP may have gone negative 9% growth. That's huge. That's huge, and the U.S. will certainly have some type of similar fate, at least directionally, as will Europe, as will Korea, as will basically any place affected by the virus. So I think it's normal, I think it's natural, I think it's nothing to be ashamed of. Now is the time to be taking care of health first and taking care of our economies as second priority.
Well, Professor Liu, you said that basically China's model cannot be indiscriminately copied around the world. China, of course, set a good precedent whereby countries are like, look, if China can contain this virus, maybe we can as well. But as you rightly mentioned, there are huge economic consequences. What do you think the rest of the world should pay attention to when they're trying to quarantine people, trying to test people, and trying to practice social distancing? with the economic consequences in mind?
Well, I think now, every major political leaders will have to come through an ethical test, and whether they are paying attention to the stock market, which is, right, but in the meantime, they cannot really forfeit the even a single life. So they cannot really make an economic trade-off between life and the economy. So therefore, I do, actually personally at least support the Chinese government view, even if we are paying huge prices economically, with life, we have time to make it up. And now I think the different type of interest groups are pulling the string behind many political leaders to shift their attention to what they really would like desire to. But that's why political leaders will have to remain rational and responsible and make the right type of calculation so that they support people's life in the first priority.
Let's hope there will be right calculations. I want to thank both of you, gentlemen. From Washington, D.C., James Early, CEO of Stansberry, China, and from Beijing, Professor Liu Baocheng from University of International Business and Economics. Thank you both so much.